Chelek Chav Gimel, volume 23, the third Sicha for Shavuos. This Sicha will discuss how, although most of the Torah seems to always have the narrative discussing physical, material, worldly things, yet the Torah really is talking about the spiritual, that is, the spiritual realm. As an introduction to familiarize ourselves with several concepts in order to easier flow through the Sicha, the first word of the Aseret HaDibros of the Ten Commandments is Anochi, which is really not a common Hebrew word. And the Chazal tell us that Anochi also stands for the Rashi Tevis, the acronym of the four words, Ano Nafshi Ksavis Yahavis, literally translated, I, Nafshi, myself, meaning my essence, Ksavis, I've written down, Yahavis, I've given it. That means this is telling us, when Hashem says Anochi, he says, I put the essence of myself into the Torah. That's one thing. Another concept, we know that the Rambam, Maimonides, he wrote his monumental work, the Mishnah Torah, or as we know it, the Yad HaChazaka, in such a manner that all mitzvahs that are constantly applicable, meaning not mitzvahs that are, or commandments that would only pertain to a certain time and certain instance. For example, in the Torah we find various commandments which have no bearing on later future generations. Only those that the Rambam deemed as applicable to all times does he discuss in his book. In other words, in his book of laws. As he says himself, this book is halachis. True, there are some of the halachas that he mentions in the book that today we cannot observe, we cannot fulfill. But that's only because of the fact that, for example, we don't have the Beis HaMikdash, or we don't live in Israel, and we don't practice certain things as a result. But the mitzvah, in essence, does apply. It's just that we don't have the ability to fulfill it. And those that Rambam discusses. Another thing to familiarize ourselves with is the idea of Ruach HaKodesh. Ruach HaKodesh, many think it's prophecy. It's not prophecy. Ruach HaKodesh really literally translates as a divine spirit, okay, or divine guidance. There are many tzaddikim, as we'll see in the Sicha, that had that special gift, that what they did was obviously by their own decision, by their own volition, but yet they had an inner guidance, so to speak, almost like a GPS, like a real GPS, where their minds, their actions, their decisions were positioned in a manner that was consistent with what Hashem wants. And then, of course, we have the two different sections in the Torah, the Nigla versus Pnimius. Nigla literally means the revealed. Pnimius means the inner teachings. The Nigla, the Torah, is the revealed part of the Torah, which is, of course, like the Mishnah, the Talmud, the Medrash, and so on. Whereas the Pnimius Torah, that is like the Kabbalah, the Chassidus, and so on. Just to quickly familiarize ourselves with some of the great personalities that we mentioned in this Sicha. So we have one of the Sfarim that's called Sefer Asara Ma'amoris, and it was written by the Rabbi, we know him as the Rama Mipanu, which is Rabbi Nachman Azariah from Panu. He lived basically in the 16th century, and he was a great Kabbalist and Jewish philosopher, Jewish thinker. Then we have the Shalah. The Shalah is an acronym for the words Shnei Luchei Sabris, which is the title of his work. He is Rabbi Yeshayahu Halevi Horowitz. You can actually go to his grave in Tveria. He's buried in close proximity to the Rambam, in the same place, basically. He also lived in the 16th century, and he was a great Kabbalist. To us, is a very vital source. Of course, as we know, according to tradition, the Tanya is based very heavily on his teachings. Then we have the Taz and the Shach, which again, they lived more or less in the same era, both of them in the 17th century. The Taz is Rabbi David Halevi Segal, and the Shach is of Shavsi HaKoyen. Both of them you can find in the Shulchan Aruch as the Noise Kelim in the margins of the Shulchan Aruch, and typically many of the halachic rulings today are based on the Shach and the Taz. Let's get into the Sicha itself. We know that even before the Torah was officially given on Har Sinai, there were many that studied Torah. In fact, there were even some mitzvahs, some commandments that were given to mankind even prior to Hashem's appearance on Mount Sinai. Also, as we know, the Chazal tell us, the Avos, that is the patriarchs, and even after that, there were those that kimus kol haTorah kula achelanitna, that they observed the entire Torah even before its official giving on Mount Sinai. So what exactly is the innovation of Har Sinai? What exactly changed? What happened? That when Hashem came on Har Sinai, now we were commanded. Now we were officially given the commandment and the obligation for the entire Torah. Hashem gave us the Torah in what manner? As I said in the introduction, Anoichi, in a manner of Ano Nafshik Savas Yahweh. Hashem put His essence into the Torah. Now, since the Torah transmits the essence of Hashem, so therefore it's very clear and obvious that the Torah is forever. The Torah could never change. The Torah does not ever change. In the words of the Rambam, quote, this Torah, its laws and its statutes will never ever change, ever, ever. Now, we do find that before Matan Torah, there were also some commandments, as we mentioned before. But those commandments were more, so to speak, of the benefit of the mankind. It was, so to speak, for the purpose of mankind. And therefore we find that from time to time they changed. Either they increased or sometimes varied. For example, the commandments that Adam HaRishon got, and later the commandments that Noach got. They changed somewhat. They were increased. They varied in accordance with the times. Later, Avrohom Avinu received even different commandments, somewhat different than that. Again, an increase in the commandments. But they were constantly evolving and changing. Why? Because the primary objective of the mitzvahs that were prior to Matan Torah was more so for the benefit of mankind. And therefore, since humans change, circumstances change, the world changes, continuously adopting and evolving, therefore, the mitzvahs that they received, the commandments they received, also adopting and evolving likewise, equally to that. However, when it comes to Matan Torah, when Hashem gave His essence to us, in other words, it's not just about us, it's about Him coming down into the world. As we said, Anoichi, Ano Nafshis Ksavis Yahavis. Now going forward, there is no change. There is no increase or decrease in the Torah and its mitzvahs. That means every mitzvah that was given, every word that was said, or that is said in the Torah, is everlasting. And it's understood that this idea, that the Torah, this idea of the eternity of the Torah, the Nitzchus HaTorah, applies not only to Torah Shebiksav, to the written law, which is obvious, you cannot add or subtract even a letter. For example, if you do so, a Torah would be puzzle. It would be rendered invalid. It's not a kosher Torah if you even add one letter or subtract one letter. But this idea applies not only to Torah Shebiksav, where it's obvious, but even to Torah Shebal Peh, to the oral law. If you look in the Gemara, if you look in the Medrash, and so on and so forth, every single thing, even the anecdotes, even the questions, even the suggestions, all that is all from Hashem. Now here comes the question. This being the case, we find throughout Shas, throughout the Gemara, that is throughout the Talmud, in various places that the Gemara discusses trufos and refuos, all kinds of remedies and even omens for various ailments and things like that. But the fact is that it's said in later commentaries and halachic authorities that these are, most of them, if not even all, no longer applicable. Why? Quote, because nature has changed. Things have changed. We're not the same. And therefore, those remedies that were discussed at that time, 2,000 years ago, and quoted in the Talmud, they no longer are effective now. They're no longer applicable. Perhaps they can even be detrimental to a person's health. Now, the question is, this doesn't make sense. We said that the Torah is nitzchi. The Torah is everlasting. Because Hashem gave himself in the Torah. And now all Torah is from Hashem, even Torah Shebaal Peh. Now, there are certain parts in the Torah which make sense that they change with time. For example, there are some prohibitions, some isurim that the Chachamim made, that they specifically explain that it's contingent with the fact that there are certain inherent dangers, and therefore they forbade it, because a person has to watch out for their health, for their well-being, for their safety, and therefore it's forbidden. Classical example, mayim hamegulim, water that was left uncovered overnight. We suspect that perhaps maybe a snake drank from it and left some of its venom, and therefore you're not allowed to drink from that water any longer. It's considered a danger. But the fact is that nowadays, since we do not live amongst snakes, we don't live in places where you have this threat of snakes, crawling around at night. Therefore, even mayim hamegulim, even uncovered water, is not considered to be a danger. Now, the pshat is not that the halacha changed. It's just that the Chacham gave us a reason for the halacha, a reason why it's asur. That reason is no longer a problem. And therefore, you don't have to adhere to this prohibition, because the prohibition is because of this reason is no longer here. But whereas when it comes to all those terufos, all those remedies mentioned in the Gemara throughout, where it's not stipulated that it's contingent with a certain circumstance or a certain time or a certain condition, rather it says this is good for this, that's good for that, how can that change? How can it be that they're no longer effective, and yet this is no contradiction to the fact that we say that the Torah is everlasting, the nitzchias haTorah, the eternity of the Torah, and yet we can say they're not applicable today. Now, this same question could be asked in the Rambam. We find in the Rambam Hilchos Deis, which is basically where the Rambam is telling us what the proper approach to life has to be for a Torah, halacha observant Jew. And there the Rambam goes through a whole regimen of how one should eat and how one should sleep, and the various things that one should do, and how you should live a healthy lifestyle, because it's important to live a healthy lifestyle. As the Rambam says, having a healthy body is conducive for serving Hashem properly, so therefore it's an obligation for every Jew. And yet, most of the things that Rambam lists here are no longer applicable today. So first of all, the Rambam never made a suggestion that this is only, he didn't stipulate that this is only contingent to his times, or only people in such a state, and so on. He says it as fact, as halachas. Then the Rambam's book is only halacha. So the question is, most of the things that the Rambam states are no longer applicable. How can it be that this is still Torah and this is still halacha? In fact, the Rebbe says, if somebody should learn just that section in the Rambam, they are fulfilling their obligation. They are now doing the mitzvah of learning Torah. So they're learning something that has no application today, that seems to be totally non-valid today, and yet this is Torah. Says the Rebbe, the explanation to this, by first prefacing a very general idea, general concept when it comes to Torah and mitzvahs. We know the famous rule that the Ramon Pano brings in his work, Asara Mamoris, that he says, quote, HaTorah midaberes be'etzem b'elyonim, that in essence the Torah speaks about the elyonim, the lofty worlds, the higher worlds. However, v'roimezes b'tachtonim, that it hints in the lower worlds. That means when we read something in the Torah, he says, you're reading something about an episode that happened here, about a narrative of another thing, about a physical object, about a cow, about a bread, about this, about that. Really, the Torah is talking about spiritual, lofty matters. It's thus just that the Torah hints it and is expressing it in a physical, material metaphor, so to speak. The Shalah HaKadosh actually expounds on this, and he explains. This doesn't mean that the Torah speaks mainly in Gashmius and just happens to be hinting to what's going on in the upper worlds. No, he says, in essence, when you learn Torah, you should know the Torah is speaking about the upper worlds. It's just the language that he uses. the way it expresses itself, the way the Torah, so to speak, gives away hints to what it's talking about, is by giving us gashmizdika, by giving us material examples. Now, certainly, and it's obvious, that when the Torah tells us a story, the Torah says Avrohom Avinu went here, or Yaakov Avinu did this with the sheep, and so on and so forth, it's obvious that ein mikra yotzei midei pshutai, that indeed happened. That's a fact. And you cannot deviate from it. You cannot just say, oh, it's metaphor, it's just some homiletics. No, that exactly the way it's described in the Torah is exactly what happened with all details. So what is the Shalah saying? What does this mean? What it's saying is that what appears in the Torah is actually what happened. But the fact that Hashem chose to tell us, the fact that Hashem chose to give us that narrative, is not because He wants us to know the actual event that took place, so to speak, in this physical world, but rather Hashem is revealing to us, Hashem is exposing to us, by means of this narrative, as a hint to what's going on in the spiritual worlds. And the same thing is in the mitzvahs. That the truth, the bottom line is that the mitzvahs have to be observed literally in the physical matter, in the literal physical matter. That means one cannot just meditate on the mitzvahs, one cannot just talk about the mitzvahs, one cannot just study about the mitzvahs, one needs to actually do the mitzvah. But it's obvious that when we do the physical mitzvah, you put on tefillin, you shake a lulav and esrog. What are you doing? You're just shaking a physical object. What really are you doing? So we all understand that it's not just a physical, it's not just the material deed that's being done here, but rather through that, we are effectively triggering the spiritual effect that happens through it. So we see the same idea. Where we're dealing with down here, you have to actually physically put on the tefillin. You have to actually physically shake the lulav and the esrog. But it's not just about that. What it is it's about the spiritual aspect of it. And at the bottom line is that the essence of Torah mitzvahs is the spiritual. Says the Rebbe, based on this, we'll understand when it comes to all those remedies and all those suggestions in the Talmud, how to heal and take care of various problems. You see, when the Torah speaks about, when the Gemara speaks about those remedies, in essence, what it's talking about is what's going on in the upper worlds, what's going on in the spiritual realm. It's just that the way things evolve into the Gashmizdika world, they become remedies for a particular problem. But since the Torah, and therefore the spiritual realm, is nitzchi, it's eternal, it never changes, therefore the healing aspect of these things, at least in the spiritual realm, are actually there all the time. In the spiritual sense, in the, so to speak, in spiritual worlds, in the spiritual realm, certainly they're continuously effective without any change, because spirituality doesn't change. The Olam HaRuchni is nitzchi. And that is, at least the way it pertains to the soul. However, the way they evolve, so to speak, down here in this world, to be an actual remedy, to be an actual trufa for the body, for the physical body, that could change. That does change. Why? Because since the world has changed, since things evolved, so the physical, material expression of it, as it appears in the Talmud, that part could change. That part has changed. That part is not the same. It doesn't have the same effect that it had back then. And here's an example, an actual example. We know that Chas v'Sholom, when a person sinned during the times of the Beis Hamikdash, how did they achieve atonement? How were they able to effect, quote, like a healing, a spiritual healing, by bringing a carbon in the Beis Hamikdash? And that was their remedy for their sin, for that spiritual illness. However, now that we don't have a Beis Hamikdash, we can't bring a carbon. It doesn't mean that the idea, the concept of the carbon is no longer there. It's there and it's still effective. But physically, we cannot do it. In other words, the physical expression of it, we cannot do. In fact, not only it won't be helpful, it won't be effective in a positive manner, but if somebody should bring a carbon today, it can actually be a detriment. Because it's a sin. You're not allowed to bring a carbon outside of the proper manner. And today we cannot bring it in the proper manner. There's no Beis HaMikdash, there's no Mizbeach, and so on and so forth. And likewise, we can also explain in the Rambam. We know that the Tumim, he writes about the Beis Yosef and the Ramah. That means the compilers of the Shulchan Aruch, the authors of the Shulchan Aruch. And the Alter Rebbe actually takes us a step further, as quoted in the Hayom Yom, that this is all the way until the Shach and the Taz, who lived, as we said, in the 17th century, that everything that they wrote was Beruach HaKodesh. What is that? What from this we can understand, which obviously they were post the Rambam, the Beis Yosef, the Ramah, the Shach, the Taz, post the Rambam. So we understand when the Rambam wrote his words, when he gave his list and of the regimen of how one is supposed to live a healthy life, he wrote that Beruach HaKodesh. He wrote what one should do physically. But really what he included, really what he was writing, was the spiritual regimen for a good, healthy life, a good, healthy spiritual life. Because as we said, the Torah speaks in this world, but really what it's talking about is the upper worlds. And therefore, the bottom line is what he was transmitting was the spiritual aspects of it, of what he was, of the spiritual aspects of a healthy life. It's just that he was expressing it in Gashmizdika thing. And this idea, we also have in the learning of Torah. We have it specifically in Torah learning. When we learn, for example, Nigla the Torah, when you learn Gemara, when you learn Mishnah, which, by the way, that you need in order to decide halacha. Halacha can be decided exclusively and only absolutely from Nigla the Torah, from the revealed part of Torah, which, as we said before, the revealed part of Torah typically speaks about, discusses matters which have to do with worldly things. It talks about the world, this world. It discusses physical, material things. A cow, a field, a slave, money matters, and so on and so forth. But it's the only way that you can determine halacha. Now, it's understood that when you learn Nigla the Torah, you're not just learning about a cow. You're not just discussing matters of money. You're not just talking about a field. What you're really talking about, you're really discussing is Hashem's chachma, Hashem's wisdom, and Hashem's ratzon, Hashem's desire as it expresses itself in these worldly things. So when a person learns Nigla the Torah, they're attached to the Nigla the Torah, to the revealed part of the Torah, but at the same time, what they're really thinking, what they're really appreciating is the fact that this, deep down, is Hashem's chachma. And this is the ultimate, that the physical part in the Torah expresses what really is going on in this spiritual part of the Torah. It's just that we need to say it in physical words. It says the Rebbe, through increasing in these two sections of the study of the Torah, which is Nigla the Torah and Nista the Torah, will come to this, will be Zoicha, will merit to the Torah of Mashiach, which there will be clear and obvious that it's all talking about the Spirit. Over there, it's already going to be after the world, as the world is already going to be in its elevated state. And then, as it says, the Alter Rebbe says in Igeres HaKodesh, that then the objective will not be to be mevarer the world, to cleanse the world, to elevate the world, but rather, when we do Torah mitzvahs,